Welcome back to Focus Today, and what a delight always to have with us Jodell Onstott. She is the author of this wonderful resource called Yahweh Exists, and she is working on, I think, volume 2. This thing is amazing. Anyway, you talk about a great Christmas gift. Check this out at Evangel or Christian Discount Books for yourself or as a gift, or you can go to YHWHExists.com and get one. Look, this is no easy read. It's a resource. It's not something you read and put back on the shelf and never go back to. This is something you will constantly go to and reference. And I have looked at it many times for various things, trying to straighten some of my theology out, which gets confused at times. Anyway, Jodell has done a wonderful job. Hi, how are you? Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you, too. I am wonderful, enjoying the cooler weather. I understand it's a lot cooler up your way.
Yeah, we're getting some snow, so we like it. We like it. Well, you know, Jodell, one of the big things here is the whole issue of Jerusalem. And even though the Scripture talks about Jerusalem, ancient Jerusalem, if the current world system could change Jerusalem to be somebody else's capital, then the whole Bible is discredited. But why is there such a fight over Jerusalem? And granted, it's an important city because it houses the three major religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. What's the battle over?
The battle really is one of history, and it is a battle waiting actually to be decided. The reason that history is so important is that anciently, Israel, it was the seat of government for ancient Israel for well over 1,000 years. For Christianity, it is the place where Jesus had his ministry, the place where he was crucified. So it's very important for Christianity. But it's also important to Islam because in Islamic tradition, Muhammad came to Jerusalem with a night of prayer, and he ascended into heaven from, as it is traditionally understood, from where the Dome of the Rock now resides. So this is a battle over territory, a battle, honestly, over identity, and a battle for control and power over the Holy Land. So it is one that is ongoing, as we well know. Scarcely a week goes by that you don't hear of some terrorist attack within the Holy Land, and often within Jerusalem. So it is very important for the sake of history as well as the future.
You mentioned that it needs to be settled, or still needs to be settled, and there has been suggestions we divide it down the middle. You've heard all of them, two-state solution for the Palestinians and the Jews. And now it's possible, under a new administration, we would move our embassy from Tel Aviv up to Jerusalem. That would make a huge statement, wouldn't it?
It really would. You know, the importance of Jerusalem politically is like a chessboard. If you can control those centerpieces in the chessboard, then you can control what happens politically to the entire area. You know, imagine if us in the United States, if we had an entity, say, in Washington, D.C., where half of Washington, D.C. was divided and either given to the Islamic State or maybe it was given to Nazi Germany. Could you imagine that regime co-inhabiting our state capital and having to decide rules of justice, of judgment, of how our nation was going to function as a republic? Could you imagine that? For us, that's the same type of situation that Israel faces. So moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem signifies that this administration and that the United States would recognize Israel and its historic legitimate claims to the city. And then that would be over the Palestinian, which that right there would produce huge conflict because the Palestinians claim that as a holy site as well.
Wouldn't that null and void the Six-Day War in 1948 when they became a state again?
It really would. You know, there has been so much territory, so much land that has been given up for the sake of peace, that Eventually, I think the lesson that Israel is beginning to learn is that it doesn't matter what land or what territory you give up. Peace cannot be achieved when there is a conflict of ideals, a conflict of the ways of governing that differ on their basis. So this is really a question of constitutional democracy, of a constitutional ideal of justice in conflict with ultimately Sharia law. That's really what it comes down to, because when you look at Islam and you look at what they want for the future with the reestablishment of a caliphate, it all goes back to Sharia. So in really, in some ways, it's kind of pitting the West against the caliphate.
All right, before we dig back into history a little bit, let's stay a little bit on the political side. UNESCO passed a very controversial resolution in October. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, and actually you do have to delve into history to understand it a little bit. In 638 BC, you have, AD. In 638 AD, you have the Islam, the caliphate that came into Jerusalem and conquered a Byzantine Jerusalem. About 60 years later, they built the Dome of the Rock. Once the Dome of the Rock was built, this site was no longer became the Temple Mount. It was no longer known as that. It became Al-Haram al-Shif, which means the noble sanctuary. And for Islam, this is the name they have termed the Temple Mount for well over 1,500 years. Well, the UN resolution makes all, or UNESCO actually, it makes all member nations recognize Jerusalem not by the name of Jerusalem, but by its Islamic name, which is Al-Haram al-Shif. So this, again, is another attempt to thwart any Israeli or any legitimacy to Israel's history and its claim to Jerusalem.
Wow. That is amazing, and I don't know if a lot of people understood that resolution came through. I don't know what that leads to, but can you imagine the conflict that could be in the immediate future with that UNESCO resolution, and yet we move our embassy to Jerusalem? That's pretty pointed. Let me take a break. We'll come back because we got to go back in history. Where did the name Jerusalem come from? Who did that belong to? And we're talking about the importance of Jerusalem with our great friend Jodell Onstott. She's the author of YHWH Exists, and you can go to YHWHExists.com, but look for this incredible resource. Make a great Christmas gift for yourself or a loved one. You can go to YHWHExists.com or look for it at Evangel or Christian Discount Books in Jacksonville. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back.
I'm Paulina Leiser, producer of Focus Today. Thank you for watching this video, and make sure to check our other videos at theDove.us.
Welcome back to Focus Today, and delighted to have back with us our good friend Jodell Onstott. She is the author of YHWH Exists, one of the great resources of our day. And look for this book at the bookstores and at Evangel or over at Christian Discount Books. It is an incredible resource. You don't read this and then say, well, I read the book and put it on the shelf. This actually will become a lifetime resource for you. And it is incredible. And so check it out at the bookstores or YHWHExists.com. We're talking about the importance of Jerusalem and who really has claim to it as their city. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, all three are represented within the old city. But there's this constant battle who Jerusalem really belongs to. Jodell, let me ask you one quick question before we move on. Wouldn't Christianity have to subordinate to Judaism as far as ownership of Jerusalem?
Not necessarily. You find that within Judaism, there is a respect for other faiths, for other beliefs. Now, would Christianity have to submit to the rules and the laws of the land? Pretty much the way Christianity does in any nation, whether you're in Egypt or the UK or Germany, you know, it really doesn't matter where you are. You pretty much submit to the laws and rules of the land. But from a theological standpoint, there tends to be a very much a camaraderie there and working together, simply because both faiths really begin with the walk of Abraham. So when you have that as the basis in the beginning and you move forward, there is actually a lot of unity there that I think a lot of people miss when we look at the history of both religious sects.
I totally get that, and you explain it extremely well. I guess what I was referring to was Christianity laying claim to Jerusalem, like they're owners of Jerusalem. We really can't do that, can we?
Well, you have, this is the interesting thing. You have no words of Jesus or the apostles that lay claim to any territory of the land. What you find Christianity was, it was a movement of the heart, a movement of the spirit to walk in the ways of God, Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commandments. So you find in many ways, Jesus is upholding the very ideals that God gave to Abraham. So when you look at that as your basis, Jesus said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Again, there's no political claim to the land. The only entity that has a political claim to the land is Israel. And then much later on, 600 years later, Islam comes in and tries to usurp that claim.
All right, so let's go there. Doesn't just Scripture support Israel laying claim to Jerusalem as being the capital, and archaeology is now coming along behind it and supporting that claim?
Yes. So what you have actually is on both sides. You have Palestinian archaeologists trying to make a claim for Jerusalem as well as the greater Israel, as well as the same of Israeli archaeologists. Thankfully, I think from our perspective, the weight of the evidence is on the side of the Israeli archaeologists. Going back to, say, 2400 BCE, one of the earliest references that we have to Jerusalem is from an inscription that terms it Yerushalayim. And this would have been a Canaanite stronghold. It later fell to the Jebusites. But even in the earliest Egyptian documents and cuneiform documents, we find that it meant the city of peace. Now, David and his men conquered the Jebusite stronghold right around 1025 BCE. And the only difference that they made to the name, the only change they made, was adding the name of God, which is YHWH. And they took what is called the theophoric element of Yah, and they added it to the name of the city of peace. So instead of being Jerusalem, it becomes Yarush, where you have the Yah added to it. So that remains intact throughout history, even during the Second Temple period, until it is destroyed by Rome, and then it's given a new name. But for well over probably 2,400 years, it had the name of the city of peace. What has been discovered archaeologically, back in 1961, there was an inscription that was uncovered in an archaeological excavation at Khirbet Bayet. And at this inscription, let me actually read it to you because it's very interesting. It's like reading almost a page out of Isaiah or Jeremiah. It says, I am YHWH, the God, and I will accept the cities of Judah, and I will redeem Jerusalem. So this city dates, archaeologically from a inscription that is found back to the 6th century. Now, here's what's ironic, is that when UNESCO made its ruling on Jerusalem to have this Islamic name, or rather the Temple Mount to have the Islamic name, months beforehand, the Israel Antiquities Authority had already scheduled a conference for that same week where they were revealing a new document. And this new document shows a Hebrew writing dating to the 7th century. This would have been the time of Josiah, the time of Ammon, and the time of Manasseh. And this document shows it's a receipt for wine as payment for taxes. But it mentions, again, Jerusalem at a very early point in time. So what this does is it shows a legitimacy for the Hebrew claim to Jerusalem that predates any Palestinian claim by at least 1,000 years.
Wow. So then UNESCO comes out with their announcement immediately. So it was kind of an attack to be a preemptive move. I'm amazed the continuing archaeological digs that go on in and around Israel and certainly Jerusalem. And as they slowly discover things, more and more of those discoveries support the Bible and events within the Bible, which you would think alone would be evidence, but somehow that doesn't get recognized.
It really doesn't. And I think a lot of it comes down to preconceived ideas of, if you accept ancient Israel's history as valid, what religious implication does that have? And I think, for those outside of Judaism, that is very uncomfortable. Those within different religions are, what politically does that mean for modern Judaism or its ramifications or authority in the greater world at large? Thankfully, again, I don't believe that that has a political implication, but it does have an implication as far as religious beliefs. There's conflict between the three great religions, and which of those will win out. We know from Scripture what is there, but there is still the process of getting there. Jerusalem, it's fascinating when you study the Scriptures that talk about Jerusalem, and how Jerusalem would be this furnace of affliction almost, where there would burn this fire that would not be quenched. So you find from Scripture that Jerusalem was prophesied to have this very tumultuous future. And history has shown that to be true. Jerusalem has been conquered and razed at least 3 times. It has been conquered over 55 times. It has been conquered and reconquered like 44 times. So you can almost define world history by looking at Jerusalem. Whoever has Jerusalem ends up being an entity that politically controls the chessboard for that territory that is in such great conflict.
Yeah, the one that we saw in our lifetime was the Six-Day War getting reestablished. But let's go to the Temple Mount. I mean, of course, the Rock of the Dome is up there, but a few feet just north of that is the Temple Mount.
Yes.
And if you do your archaeological digs there and you just look at the age of the stone and the size of the stone, it leans towards biblical authenticity more than anything else, doesn't it?
It really does. Not only do we have the inscriptions, but you also have the Temple Mount Sifting Project that is going through all the rubbish that the Islamists or the Al-Wadif have done in doing unauthorized excavations. And what they're really trying to do with these excavations is to hide Israel's history and the ties to its past. Thankfully, a permit has been secured, and they've been sifting through those remains for about 15, 20 years now. But you come up with some incredible seals. The seal of Hezekiah has been found. You have all these different things that have been found, and none of them discredit Scripture in any regard. I do want to mention very quickly, there was a biblical conference that was held right before Thanksgiving. And one of the papers that was presented there suggests the possibility that ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics formed the early basis of Proto-Hebrew. And the author went through and translated a few of the ancient Egyptian inscriptions based on a Proto-Hebrew alphabet. And when he did this, he found that there was a reference to Joseph. There was a reference to Joseph's wife in ancient Egyptian inscriptions that date right around 1830 BCE. So this has the promise for the future between biblical studies, archaeology is really unlimited, and it is exciting to see what scholarship is adding to our understanding. I think we're just at the beginning of a wonderful, fantastic time of learning and growth.
I'm just fascinated by it. And I'd like to maybe follow up with you because of your research, especially in Yahweh Exists. Out of this come the other 4 branches of religion. You have Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Christianity, and Judaism, all fighting for preeminence, so to speak. And I don't know where that fits into this history, but it's pretty amazing, because it would seem to me that if Jerusalem was conquered by someone else, let's say the Islamic or Muslims conquered Jerusalem again. I mean, it sets the argument back to square one, doesn't it?
You would think so. But what you have, if you view the Old Testament, the prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah, as something that are legitimate and binding, what you find is a very land-centric theology. And this was something that I was totally ignorant of before I began my in-depth study for 16 years. And there are something like well over 45 prophecies that talk about God dispersing the nation of Israel through all the nations of the earth, and then him bringing back to the land. Genesis 15, the promised land covenant, had originally promised the specific territory from the Euphrates River in the north to a now defunct Pelusic branch of the Nile in the south. He had promised that territory of land to Abraham and his descendants. So if we understand that truth is something that is unchanging, that God himself is an unchanging God, then from a theological standpoint, that territory of land still remains for Abraham's descendants, whether they are Christian or whether they are Jewish. You know, we often forget that lineage is not necessarily defined by religion.
Wow, you're fascinating. Let's do that. Let's unpack that someday, okay? Listen, I just can't say enough for her research, and a lot of this you can get through her writings, and especially in the book called Yahweh Exists. Let me encourage you to check it out. It is an incredible resource. Check it out at Christian Discount Books in Jacksonville, or you can go to Evangel, or you can go online to YHWHExists.com in order. Jodell, thank you. You're a delight. I'm just so fascinated by this. I think we ought to do the prophecies of the Jews coming back to their homeland. I think that's fascinating. Okay?
That's great. I'd love that.
All right. God bless you. Best to you. Merry Christmas. We don't talk sooner. Okay. We'll see you next time on Focus Today.